Hello, 'tis I, Bulldog. Welcome to the experience. Uh, as you know, like, share, and subscribe, build the channel. My cup is full, and my bowl is full, and I am full of happiness to, bring to you interesting people that I know and like to interview. So today's guest is another fight master of FDC, Todd Campbell. Um, really nice guy, knows his stuff. Historically, a lot of discussion about the past and the evolution of swordplay. It's quite a wonderful little thing. So anyway, Todd Bulldog, take it away. All right. My next guest here is another FDC fight master. He's also known for television, seen him on many a commercial. I'd like to welcome to the show Todd Campbell. How are you doing, my friend? Good to see you.
I'm doing all right, Bulldog.
That's good. That's good. Been keeping busy throughout pandemic?
Yes, and I apologize. My cat Zoe is obsessed with a webcam whenever I'm on it, so she'll probably be running through the screen.
It is fine. I too have my little Lucifer who will inevitably pop up and say hello. All right. So yeah, thank you for coming on the show. I guess the big thing is to start us off. What started you off? What was sort of the spark that made you go, pointy things? That's what I want to do. That's sort of the thing of me.
Well, I've always, for as long as I can remember, I've always been obsessed with fantasy and swordplay and stuff. You know, from Star Wars, which was really the first movie I remember seeing when I was a kid, through like Masters of the Universe, and then later playing Dungeons and Dragons. So I've always been kind of obsessed with swords. And then I remember the first time I went to Stratford, I was in high school, and I remember going into the festival theater and seeing up on the wall this huge picture of Sir Alec Guinness playing Richard III. And I'm like, wow, Obi-Wan Kenobi? For real? And that got me interested in Shakespeare. And when I was in theater school, I had a really great stage combat program. I went to theater school in New York, the American Musical and Dramatic Academy, and we had stage combat class like every other day. We had so much of it that I was able to get my certification by the end of the program. And from there, I just kind of fell into it. Like every time I worked on a show, I was the most competent person in the room at that time. I mean, now there's a lot more people who are trained, but back in the early to mid 90s, there weren't a lot of us.
What was like? Was it FDC that you were certified in, or is it the American version?
The American, the Society of American Fight Directors, which predates us here in Canada. So the SAFD started in, I believe, the late 60s, early 70s, and we didn't start until the early 90s.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, I talked to Dan about FDC and his role and sort of a lot about FDC and and its advancement in it. So yeah, you got your certificate, and then obviously fight up to fight master now. You're kind of renowned through Rapier Wood as being the historical man, the person who takes a really hard look at Capoferro and buckler sword fight. What drew you to that aspect of it?
The very first, there's two parts to it, and I'll explain. So the very first time I was asked to fight direct a show was back in 90, this must have been 1996. And I had a basic certificate with the Society of American Fight Directors, which meant I had rapier and dagger, broadsword, and unarmed were the things I was certified in. And so I kind of thought, you know what, I can teach people how to do a fight, but can I choreograph a fight? That I don't know. And so I went to the reference library because this was the early 90s, right? The internet wasn't much of a thing at that point. So I went to the Toronto Metro Reference Library and I looked for books on stage combat, of which there were very few. And so then I broadened my search parameters and I looked for stuff on fighting, and I found this book, The Art and History of Personal Combat by Arthur Wise. And in it, there's a ton of these pictures of people fighting with rapiers and daggers from manuscripts from like the 16th century, the 15th century. And I was shocked that we had actual documentation of how these fights would have looked. And the other thing that really surprised me was how dramatic those pictures were. I'm like, wow, I want to see that on stage. And it looked very different than the stuff that I had been taught. So from that point on, I was really interested in learning more about the realities of actual combat, and then finding ways of bringing that into my art. Now, the second part of the story was the very first time I tested for the SAFD, I failed. And there's two reasons for that. One was that at the time with the SAFD, you would do all three of your test fights as one scene. And my partner and I just couldn't find a scene that worked for all three of those fights. So we ended up constructing our own scene. It was kind of like something that we do at FDC now quite regularly, where we set a scene to music and it had like a structure and stuff, but it didn't have dialogue. And we didn't realize at the time that with the SAFD, you have to have a printed scene. So like, go get a scene and come back and do it again. But the other reason why I failed was because the fight master at the time said that my broadsword work was too, and I'm going to keep using the word broadsword, which I know is incorrect, and we can talk about that later. But
yeah,
my broadsword work was too laborious. It was too clunky. It didn't have the flow that he really wanted to see, and that was a choice on my part. Like, I was at the time like 160 pounds soaking wet. I had pipe cleaner arms. I wasn't very strong, and I was told that the swords that you would fight with in the day were not the like 3 or 4 pound swords that we were fighting with, but they would have been much heavier. So the average medieval broadsword was somewhere between 8 to 20 pounds.
Yeah, I hear that all the time. Yeah.
And of course, that is an absolute lie. That's not true at all. But it wasn't that my instructors were trying to deceive me in any way. It's just it was a game of telephone, I think. Like, someone had said, I think a broadsword is probably around the same weight as the one that we were using, so about 4 pounds, which is still kind of heavy for that style of sword. We're talking basically a long sword with a kind of short blade, sometimes referred to as a bastard sword. So 3 or 4 pounds is kind of heavy for that type of sword. And then this giant game of telephone happened where people kept increasing the weight to make it seem like the swords we were fighting with were actually light. And by the time I heard it, it could be up to 20 pounds. And so once I realized that that was not the case, I wanted to find out more and more about that, which drove me down that path. I like research. I like finding out the truth and the reality behind the stuff that I play as an actor. So it was just a natural progression for me.
Well, it lends credibility to what you're seeing on stage or on the screen, right? Like, if you're actually doing the things that these people would be doing at that point, it gives it, it lends itself to more of like, oh yeah, absolutely, this is totally believable.
And I've always found it much easier to learn choreography that has some sort of internal reality. Even if it's fantasy built, it's got to make some sort of sense. Whereas I think everyone who's in the stage combat game at one point or another has done a fight where it didn't make any sense to them. It's like, why am I doing this exactly? And you end up getting some sort of bullshit answer, and then someone will tell you, oh, just do the choreography. But I really think that you should approach your fight in the same way you would approach your scene. You research it, you look at all of the nuances, you find specific moment-to-moment actions, and you play those, as opposed to just swinging the sword and screaming.
Yeah, you actually fence, correct? Like, you're a historical fencer as well.
I've done some, and I've done some strictly so that I could learn the language and structure of the art, so that I could then manipulate it for stage or for screen. So I'm not a very good fencer. In fact, all of my instincts tell me not to hit anyone because I've trained as a stage fighter for so long. So often I would really upset my partners or my fencing coach because I would be stopping just before I would hit, or I would divert at the last minute. It took a lot of willpower for me to actually strike someone.
Stab them in the face. Don't stab them in the face.
Exactly.
Yeah. What was it that you've done for like actual, like, just to like broaden to step into that was I know that you're Capo Ferro, right?
Yeah, I did some training with a gentleman named Bo Brock, who was teaching Capo Ferro out of the let me see if I can get this right, the Association of European Medieval Martial Artists, so EMMA, which is a group here in Toronto. They now have branches in Ottawa and I think in Guelph as well. And so I trained with them for a while. And then what I really like to do, though, is they would bring in people who were specialists in a particular type of historical combat, and they bring them in for a weekend. And those weekend workshops were great for me because they were these little like intensives where I could get to see the art form and understand some of the language behind it, so that I can go back and look at the original sources and I can read it with some understanding. Because a lot of the old manuscripts, they're written in the language of the swordplay of the time. So you have to, it's like reading a technical manual. You've got to kind of understand that language. So these weekend workshops acted as my Rosetta Stone. So I did a weekend workshop. The first one I did was with a guy named Stephen Hand, who wrote an interpretation of the 133 manuscript, which is the oldest known fencing manuscript we know of, and it's on an ancient form of sword and buckler. It comes from like the end of the 13th, beginning of the 14th century, somewhere around there. And I remember the first one I did, because I ended up doing two in the system. And the first one I did, it was really fun, and I walked away and I'm like, I can't use any of this because everything is stabbing people in the face. It's all done at the same time. Like, there's no way I can make this safe or tell a story. And it took me a second workshop to really figure out, okay, I see now what the language is, what the intention is. So now I can sort of craft something that's not quite the true art, but close enough that if you were watching it, you go, oh, well, that's 133, or that's Capo Ferro, or that's, Spanish rapier.
Mm. Oh, that's really neat. And like it's so interesting that you're so impassioned about that. Do you find that it though, with sort of gaining this knowledge, do you find that watching stuff like the Duelist, for example, or Princess Bride, is there moments that you're going like, it could have just, if you would have just for like two, like but are you, can you shut your brain off enough that you're like, okay, that's fine, it's the time period, or is there still a little nagging voice in your head going like,
yeah, there's
we could do that better?
It's a very loud nagging voice. And now the Duelist is very interesting because William Hobbs, who directed that, he was also very interested in historical swordplay. So a lot of his work I find very close to the real stuff, or at least closer. His, like, the Duelist is one of my favorite examples of sword fighting on film. His work in Rob Roy, the fight at the end of Rob Roy is fantastic.
With Liam Neeson and oh shoot, what's his name?
Yes, I can't remember it. Tim Roth.
Yeah, Tim Roth. Yeah. No quarter given.
Exactly. It's a fantastic fight, and is probably not as historically accurate as someone who practices that art would want, but it's much closer than what we often see. Mm-hmm. And what we often see is European swords, especially medieval swords, being used basically like sharpened baseball bats. This whole idea of might makes right, and the strongest person is always going to win. And there's often depictions of European swordplay in film make it seem like there isn't a lot of skill involved,
or finesse, finesse. Yeah.
Whereas that's clearly not the case. And for me, rapier is the one that I don't think we've got a really great example of a good rapier fight yet. because a lot of them still cling on to that old Hollywood view of rapier, and the old Hollywood view was they basically took what they were doing with Olympic saber fencing at the time, or classical saber fencing, and they theatricalized that and then applied that to every sword. So if you look at a lot of those old films, some of the fights are fantastic. Like the Mark of Zorro is one of the best sword fights ever captured on film, and it's fought with saber hilts, with fencing sabers. But then there's other things where they're fighting with broadswords, or they're fighting with rapiers, or they're fighting with small swords, and they're all just doing the same technique. They just have a different sword in their hand. Which I understand the utility of that, making something that's easy that everyone and universal that everyone can do. But in the long run, I think it gets kind of boring, and I want to see something that's more, again, true to the reality of the time.
Would you say I come up to you, I'm a director, I got $1 billion, what have you, and we're remaking this movie. What one would you say that would best give for historical rapier fighting? Because I know how much you enjoy that. So let's just say, like, here's $1 bazillion, fight choreograph this and make it so that we could actually. Is there anything that you'd think that would blend that well together?
Yeah, I mean, a Three Musketeers, a Romeo and Juliet, Elatrice. Elatrice is really good. I love the Viggo Mortensen films, but the fighting in it I'm not as hot on. So yeah, I think pretty much anything that has a rapier in it, I would be happy to come up with fights that are more accurate. And I put accurate in quotation marks because we can't be completely accurate, right? I mean, it's there has to be enough change to the art to make it safe so that the actors don't hurt themselves, but and also tell a story. So like with rapier, a lot of the actions are in what's called stesso tempo, or single time. So as you're coming in and attacking, I'm also coming in, defending and counterattacking. And trying to tell a whole fight like that would become very messy and be hard for an audience to follow. A couple of actions like that within a fight can be very exciting, however. So it's kind of those sort of things that you have to change and adjust to make it more theatrical. So if someone looked at my rapier fight, for instance, they would recognize a lot of stuff in it, but it wouldn't look exactly like them fencing in a saddle.
Well, you also have to be cautious about that in general, because again, like you said, it's a martial techniques, right? So and the coming in at the same time as defending, pushing the blade away, and then making your mark, and it's usually through I recall the manuscript for the Capaferro's stuff. There's like you see the end of the blade going out through there, so it's
skull.
It's not exactly the best thing to do when you're you have to do another 2 or 3 shows in the week, right?
Yeah, totally.
Would you say that you're like it has been improving, right? Like I've saw the new curriculum for FDC, what we're planning on doing. Do you feel that this is going to, like, because like you said, it's so easy with the general, here's everything, we'll just do it this way. Do you feel that it's going to really start enriching? Like, have you noticed that, like, in a more of a sort of a meteor buffet, I would say, of fighting, directing in film and television and stage?
Well, I mean, it's yes and no. In small pockets, yes, but it's hard, right? A lot of people within the industry want to stick with what they know, and so in film, you'll often see stunt coordinators usually don't base their European sword fights on European sources. They just do like the basic. Mostly it's basic Filipino martial arts. So Filipino martial arts became very popular within the film world over the last, 30 years or so. And so I had a friend who was on a show here in Toronto that had some some sword fights in it, and they were basically using Kali stick forms, right? They were using those parries and movements and combinations that you would get from this Filipino martial arts. So I don't see a lot of it yet. It's been happening a little bit in the video game world. So there's been a couple of video games that are based on European fighting where they've got some people in who have that training. There's a few groups that you can find. There's one on YouTube, Andoria, I believe is what they call themselves. They're out of the Czech Republic, and they are fantastic. They are historical martial artists who also are stunt performers, and their fights are just amazing. Like they're just out of this world. But and they've been in a few films, but it's slowly moving that direction. And with stage, it just depends on who's doing it, right? I think there is much more interest in fights that are more accurate to their true form, but that's with a younger generation of fight directors who are still sort of making their way up in the biz. And a lot of people, I mean, if you want to be a successful working fight director, your best bet is to keep everything really simple. Keep it pretty simple, make it so that actors can pick it up really easy and they don't have to rehearse a lot. That will make directors very happy. Whereas the type of thing I'm doing is it's more complex. It's
I can attest for that. Yes, it is. Well, yeah. but in a good way. It is, and your way that you teach it is very easy to pick up too. There's stuff that, like, even if you're not thinking about it, sometimes you're like distinguere the blade and cavazione counter cavazione de obbedienza, that sort of.
And I hope at the end of the day, what I'm able to accomplish is to, by teaching people the reasons why you do the actions in the fight, you'll be able to perform the fight better and learn it quicker. Whereas the older approach to learning fights is you learn it like a dance. So it's just this routine. I go high, I go low, I go back, I'll go forth. And I've never been able to learn fights well in that way because I'm not a dancer. I need to understand the intention behind each and every movement, as opposed to just learning it like a rote thing. Right?
Well, and part of FDC is story and style, right? Like safety, story, and style, right? And that absolutely is the thing is what you just said, and also it makes it way more interesting. You're wanting to, there's an opening there, that's why he went for that. I saw that. Okay, that's kind of neat that they would do that, and as opposed to just being like, okay, we're doing the 4-5 shuffle, right? 4-5 shuffle, right? And it's like, no, absolutely, I can really see that.
But to say that though, that sort of flashy, meaningless, that's the wrong way of saying it, but that flashy sort of hollow style of fighting is really popular with directors. It's often really popular with actors because it's easier to perform. So, if I was smart, I probably would have stuck to that, but this is what brings me joy.
No, absolutely. And again, like I said, I find it interesting. I guess there's that nitpick thing we were mentioning earlier about the whole broadsword or the two-handed sword versus, like, do you feel that the lexicon is changing for the better?
It is. And a lot of the thing is that for the longest time, the only people who had any knowledge about European swords or sword fighting were fight directors. And we had a limited amount of knowledge we could draw from. So often, fight directors would come up with, when they were asked about these things, they would come up with, bullshit. They would come up with bullshit about these swords, not in a nefarious way. They were just asked about something and think, like I remember hearing someone, here's a parrying dagger of the sort of 16th century. And I remember asking a fight master once, what's the ring for? And he said, well, it's, you can put either your finger through it or your thumb through it. And that's not the case at all. With the whole point of the ring is that when you hold the dagger properly, the ring protects your knuckles when you're parrying. But the fight director didn't. This particular guy didn't know, and so he made something up that seemed to make a lot of sense to him at the time. And you can actually see there's an old Three Musketeers movie with Mila Jovovich, and on the cover, the guy who plays Aramis was coached by this particular guy. And on the poster, he's holding his dagger like this. And it drives me up the wall, Bulldog. It makes me want to stab someone. But
using proper technique and
yeah, but the difference now is that we've had about 30 years of a revival of historical martial arts where scholars and martial artists and all sorts of people have gone back and looked at the actual texts and tried to translate them into modern English or German or whatever the case may be, and figure out how these weapons were used. And we have a pretty good idea about how these things were used. A lot of it, like the term broadsword. The term broadsword was very popular in the. I think the first time we hear it is in the 17th century, the later half of the 17th century. And essentially, once you get to the age of the small sword and the saber, if you had something with a wider blade than that, then you would call it a broadsword. So there are many sabers that had very broad blades that would have been called broadswords. So the English army had a manual for their army on saber and broadsword. So those were kind of, they basically had the same hilt, but just had a broad blade or a slightly curved blade. And in the 19th century, there was a revival of interest in historical martial arts in England. And there's three guys who started doing some research on it. And one of the guys, Richard Burton, not the actor, he's a little older than that. He wrote a book called The Book of the Sword, in which he went around and he basically classified every sword that he could find. And anything that had a wide blade, he called a broadsword. Whether it was a Roman gladius, an Egyptian sword, an African sword, or a medieval sword, if it had a wide blade, he called it a broadsword.
Oh, yeah.
And then that lexicon moved its way over to Dungeons and Dragons. And then that popularized the term broadsword to mean a medieval cross-hilted sword. But historically, it was never called that. It was simply called a sword, or sometimes an arming sword, or a side sword sometimes. But sword was really what it was called. But we have it locked into our brains that broadsword means a medieval sword, and that's simply not the case. That was a mistake.
You've went to Europe and have handled, or
no,
was it? No,
I've never been to Europe. I've talked to people who've had the opportunity to handle some real swords. Fortunately, I never have. I've asked at the ROM, but they won't let me look at them.
Those jerks.
But the interesting thing about historical swords is that they aren't as heavy as we think they are as staged combat performers. In the fencing world, the HEMA people, the historical and medieval martial arts people, are always telling their students that older swords were heavier because they're used to modern fencing foils, which are super lightweight. But we in the stage combat community are used to really heavy stage combat swords that are way overbuilt and way too heavy for what they are. And so when you actually look at the historical options, they're lighter, but more importantly, their balance is better. So they're highly skilled pieces of art that are balanced for what they're meant to do. So if you picked up a Napoleonic saber, you'd feel it was very heavy. But if you start moving it around in the way you want to move around a saber, it works really well and it wants to move.
So you built like a Sherman tank handle like a Ferrari.
Yeah. Like a friend of mine had a chance. He was in Scotland and he had a chance to. He was working with a guy who refurbishes old swords, and he got a chance to handle the last sword that Rob Roy McGregor had a duel with. So Paul McDonald is the guy who was refurbishing it, and my friend Matt had a chance to handle it. And I asked him what the handling was like, and he said, "Well, it had a good presence. Like you felt it in your hand. It certainly wasn't light, but when you started moving it, it just kind of wanted to go. Like it wanted to move in the way it wanted to move, right? Like you don't have to force it."
Yeah.
And that's the big thing. So a lot of people who grew up on Conan and He-Man and that sort of thing, they go into the armory at Rapier Wit and they find the heaviest sword they can, and they're like, "I have the power," and then they swing it around like a baseball bat, right? And flex while they're doing it. I'm like, no, man, you got to relax. You need something that's light and easy and moves for you, right? Well, like you shouldn't be fighting your sword.
Well, it's like when it did the whole 20-pound thing, right? And then you start thinking about it. Like I worked in the oil patch, and like you're out there swinging a 5-pound or 10-pound hammer, like to move things, like, and you're swinging that all day, and by the end of the day, you just want to die. Like, could you imagine going into battle?
No.
And having to fight for 2-3 hours with like first 5 swings you're wanting? It's like, this is too much. This is just ridiculous. Why would you even? But it's so interesting that how that's like, oh no, that's the way because it's always been this way.
Well, even like the biggest great sword or Zweihander, which were like in the 5 to 6 feet range, like the size of a person, even they were in the 5 to 8 pound range. But that's a sword you use with 2 hands, and it's huge. Like once you get it going, you don't want it to stop. The idea that you could take something that was over 10 pounds in 1 or 2 hands and swing it around with any sort of efficacy is ridiculous. And often stage combat swords are overbuilt, right? So they're on way too heavy for what they are, and they're too small for what they are. So
is that because of like, again, back to the old days? Oh, that's just the way that we built them. Or is it because, like, you don't want your sword to go bing and then, like, midway through it's flying into the front row with Granny sitting there and she catches a errant piece of hilt to the face?
Yeah, I imagine where this comes from is in the early days of organized stage combat. There weren't a lot of people who were making swords. That, like, prop shops were making them, and they were probably just getting like wall hangers from Toledo, like crappy blades, and trying to fight with those, and they'd break. And so the first sword manufacturer in the U.S. that I can think of is a company that was making these swords out of semi-truck springs, and they were touting these blades as being actor-proof, completely indestructible, and they would show you how tough they were by driving over them with said semi-trucks, and showing you that they don't bend or break. But they were quite thick. The edges were very thick, like probably the same. This is an aluminum dagger, but probably like the same thickness as this, or maybe even a little thicker. So this is a fairly thick-edged blade. But to keep them not overly heavy, they would make the blades narrower and narrower and shorter. So you have these swords that kind of look like a child's drawing of a sword. Like they have no taper. They don't have any distal taper either. So they don't taper this way, but they also don't taper that way.
So it's just a square. It's a
cube
bar of steel with a somewhat point on it. Oh,
yeah,
dear.
which I like to refer to as vaguely sword-shaped props. Over time, some manufacturers got better and better, but they started making things specifically for the stage combat community. So there's a few companies that make steel swords with super heavy pommels, because the old school way of making a parry, and a lot of people still do this, is you parry straight up and down. So there is no angulation to the blade. Whereas historically, most of the time, you want to have your blade angled towards the person you're fighting, as opposed to just like this. But this is considered safer, right? Because it points straight up and down, and the points straight down.
Lots to stop.
Yeah. Even though it's breaking my wrist here and it's structurally it's not great, but because of that, they make their pummels so heavy that when you parry, the sword naturally wants to just fall into that position, which is a great construction, but bad if you want to try and do the work that I'm doing. So there's a lot of those older, or even some of the newer stage combat steel swords that I find not great for our purpose.
Are you gonna maybe take a chance at designing stuff like ideal, like maybe get in touch with the company? I don't know. I'm just it seems that like as far as knowledge is concerned, you seem to have a grasp on it. I don't know, maybe it'd be beneficial if you were to team up with.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of, not really, but I was kind of teamed up with a guy here in Toronto who's making aluminum blades for me. And I'm a huge fan of aluminum. I think it's a much better material for theatrical swords than steel.
Well, yeah, lightweight, and also longevity of it too, I would say, would probably be a factor.
The thing with steel is that if you don't have a thick edge, or even with an edge this thick, the steel will burr, which means that when the metal hits each other, it compresses and it creates this little tiny, like bent over piece of steel.
Yeah.
And you have to keep filing and brushing that out. And then over time, enough of the edge compresses that you don't get those burrs, or you don't get them as heavily. If you want something light enough to do the work that I'm usually doing, you would have to have a fairly thin edge. And there are people who fight with steel swords that have very thin edges, but they burr too much for as much as I can see them. And I like aluminum because they hardly ever burr. I've had long swords in my armory for 12 years now that have seen almost constant use, and I don't even think I've ever deburred them. I think at most I've run a little bit of sandpaper just if there's little tiny burrs, but I've never had those big sharp burrs you used to get on steel all the time.
Yeah.
You also don't have to worry about constantly cleaning the blades and oiling the blades. Aluminum doesn't really need that work.
No oxidization there. Thank you very much.
Like you can see on this dagger, there's nothing on this blade, whereas on the steel hilt, there is a little bit of oxidation that's happened. So I will have to give these some work, but the blades themselves are perfectly fine. And they're, as long as they're made of aircraft aluminum, which is a tempered aluminum, you're going to get a blade that's fairly strong, that's pretty light weight. You can get that thick edge and still have a balance that feels more like a steel sword. You don't have to do much work with them. So I love them.
So that'd be a good recommendation to say somebody, one of our listeners here is like, oh, I want to, start acquiring weapons, and that aluminum would be better suited for.
I mean, that's what I like. And if you are going to build an armory for yourself, that you'll have enough that everyone that you work with will be able to have a sword, which is what I did, then I would highly recommend aluminum over steel. However, if you're in a community where everyone fights with steel, then you're probably going to want to get steel.
Yeah.
So it just depends on where you are and what you're doing. I really like aluminum. I think it's becoming more and more prevalent on stage. Like when I first started out, nobody was using aluminum. And I was the first person who started in Toronto, at least, acquiring. And at one point, I built a few pieces to build up my armory. But and most people thought I was crazy because they liked their steel, and they had invested enough in their steel that they were like, I don't want to have to trade over. But the new thing in film is bamboo. Bamboo has become extremely popular for fighting. So on the set of Vikings, they use bamboo swords for all of their stunts. And I've had a chance to check it. So it's they get this. It's from they use this a lot in Asian film. They get bamboo. I think for Vikings, what they do is they go out and they buy bamboo flooring tiles, and then they shape those into the blade. And then I'm not sure if they cover them. I know in like in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, those swords were bamboo that had aluminum tape on them so that they would have that shine. I think on Vikings, they paint them. And then as they get bashed up, they just cover them with blood and mud because it's Vikings, right? Yeah, I talked to someone who was a stunt guy on Vikings, and they actually handle up quite well. Like they said, if they make a bamboo sword, it will usually last them the season of the show, so they don't break as frequently as you would think.
Probably
super light
and probably cheap too. Like bamboo grows like wood.
Yeah, cheap and replenishable. There's just the time to make them, right? Because I don't think there's anyone who constructs. I think that's something you want your props department to build for you. But,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Neat. You came up in conversation in one of my shows, and we were discussing death and getting stabbed and like the amount of time it took. And I remembered 15, or if it was 15 minutes or what have you. What
15 seconds.
So 15 seconds. Okay.
Yeah.
I remember 15, but yeah.
So I got this from an American fight director named Jared Kirby, and he got it from, I'm not sure who, but there was a book called On Death, and in it, I think it's from this book he got this information, but I might be wrong. Check your sources. Apparently, if you were stabbed, let's say, and you were stabbed in the perfect place in the heart, that you're going to die pretty quick, it's still going to take about 10 to 15 seconds for you to bleed out. And so the idea is, he teaches this in his martial arts work. So he also teaches historical martial arts. And so he'll have you hit somebody, and then they time out 15 seconds. And in those 15 seconds, the person who's dying gets an adrenaline rush and they charge at you. And the idea is to teach the student fencer, that once you've landed the hit, you need to get out of there and keep your guard up, because the fight isn't over. And I like to do that in stage combat, because often we will have people do the killing blow, pull the sword out, and then just drop their guard and stand there. like now the fight scene is over and we're back to the acting scene. I'm like, no, you're still in danger, right? And that's a lot of the work that we need to do as actors, is to find ways to imbue danger into props that we know are safe, right? Like, I know I'm not going to get hurt. I'm not going to get lethally stabbed. I could get hurt by this. It's still a piece of metal, but I'm not likely to get lethally stabbed by this. So often you'll have people stand like right up in each other's grills, pull out their swords, and they're so close that they could stab each other. I'm like, no, you need to find distance and make sure that these become are treated with the respect that they deserve, right? Like, it's like if someone pulled a gun on you. If someone pulled a gun on you, that would change your demeanor, right? Because you understand what might happen. The tensions and the stakes go up. It's the same thing with swords. But we have this kind of lackadaisical thing with swords because we spend so much time with them in studio, like just holding them, and they're on the floor and we're waving them around. We don't
grab a water.
Them. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like you'll see people doing this with them. You're like, and we don't imbue them with the same sort of danger and lethality that they should have.
What was that you just grabbed us?
This is one of my small swords. So it's a lovely small sword from a gentleman named Dave Baker from the Hollywood Combat Center. You might know Dave. He's one of the judges on Forged in Fire. And he made a set of 6 of these or 8 of these for me when I was at Stratford, and I was doing a production of Dangerous Liaisons. And Stratford decided they didn't want to rent them from me. They wanted to just buy them from me. So then I ordered a new set. And this is one of the ones from that set. Aluminum bladed. And it does have a hollow grind. It's not as hollow as a traditional small sword, but it is there. And what that means is that it's hollowed out on each of its 3 sides, giving it a shape kind of like like that ish, right?
Mhm. Is that sort of historical appropriate as well for, I guess it'd be French, yeah.
Yeah, for a French small sword, although small swords
Seven.
became very ubiquitous. So after, as the rapier became less and less popular in the later half of the 17th century, the small sword and the French school of fencing became much more popular.
I guess
so,
oh, sorry, I was just going to
no,
say,
go ahead.
I guess that's kind of neat that you get to see as the weaponry evolves, so did the techniques in that, right? Because like I'm sure stuff that the what was it, the 113
The sword and
book,
buckler.
yeah, sword and buckler wouldn't really apply technique wise to the Italians rapier.
Well,
Or can you, or I guess that's the thing. Do you see the overlap in the history of it?
to a certain extent, yes. What's interesting about the 133 manuscript is, even though it's from a much earlier time period, it's just as sophisticated and just as complex as the later rapier and dagger work. Now, the other thing interesting with 133 is that it was an advanced manuscript. It was not like a beginner's sword fighting with sword and buckler. And often within it, it talks about the common fencer, which is the fencer who would fight as everyone else did with their sword and bucklers. And it's giving you a more structured and skillful way of using the sword and buckler to defeat your opponent.
Would you
But
say
it
like
is just as complex.
hidden techniques type deal, or is it more
Hidden
like
techniques? Totally. I mean, there's things in there that would look weird to someone who wasn't trained in that system, and they might see an opening, but that's just a ploy from you to get them to do a thing. Like there's one position called fiddle bow, where you have the buckler in your hand. And for those of you who don't know, I've got a buckler right here. Buckler is a little hand shield. So it's a very tiny shield, but if I'm facing you and I put the shield in front of me, you can see it actually covers a lot of my body, even though it's so small. If I hold it close to my body, it doesn't cover a lot, but as I extend it out, it gives me more and more protection. So it's a system where you want to have that buckler extended out in front of you. And there's a thing called fiddle bow, where you have the buckler, your sword over top of your forearm, kind of like you were playing a fiddle. And I keep it a little low, and I'm inviting a thrust towards my face. So when they thrust, I can parry, wrap and grab their blade with the buckler, and then cut at their arm. So it does offer these very interesting and very complex techniques for what you would think would be a much simpler time. So it's not like one of the problems that the hopcollogists, those guys in the 19th century, when they were looking back at old combat, had is they were trying to like jam this Darwinian way of thinking onto the evolution of sword fighting, so that you would start with the medieval sword, which was heavy and brutish and wasn't very skillful, and then slowly it would develop into the rapier that had more skill, and then the small sword that was the epitome of that art form, and then the saber, which is the epitome of the cutting art form. And so you have this evolution of fighting with swords. And that was not really the case. Swords often change just because of fashion. So the rapier was, it was popular not just because of the interesting ways you could fight with it, but also because it was a very pretty sword. It was, I think, one of the prettiest of the swords.
Now you've seen the Princess Bride, for example. We were discussing the intricacy of this. My father's sword, the best one that he ever built, right? And it is. They are quite lovely. Oh, it's pretty neat. That you can see that and are able to kind of be like, yeah, no. But you wouldn't. Could you say cross fight, I guess, in that regard?
Like rapier and dagger versus sword and buckler?
Yeah, if for example.
In fact, that's what happens in Romeo and Juliet. So in Romeo and Juliet, we're seeing that change between the earlier sword and buckler man to the rapier and dagger guy, which is why Mercutio has that speech about Tybalt, where he says Tybalt fights by the book of arithmetic. He is the very butcher of a silk button. And he talks about the passato, which is an Italian term for just a pass, basically. And then he says that he's not comfortable sitting on the old bench. He needs the new form. So clearly Mercutio and of course the servants in it, they're in the play, are all fighting in that older sword and buckler tradition. Not the sword and buckler tradition from the 133 manuscript. There was an Italian sword and buckler tradition that was very popular from the Bolognese school. And we see Tybalt representing that new sort of fad of the rapier and the dagger. So yeah, it's right there, right? So there's one of the first Romeo and Juliets I did. I specifically armed my servants in Mercutio with swords and bucklers, and then the Capulets were all rapier and dagger guys.
That's really neat. That's and there you go. Just how good Shakespeare was, just to like understand that. No, yeah, no. There's the play of it, like the dichotomy of what can I do with this. I'm sure it was a little bit more prevalent in his time, though. Yeah.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And his the actors in Shakespeare's plays and probably Shakespeare himself are thought to have trained in a couple of schools in London, one of which was George Silver's school. And George Silver was really interesting because he was an English fencing master who was kind of being displaced by these foreign fencing masters coming in. So you'd have these Italian guys coming over to England and teaching guys how to fight with rapiers and daggers. And the rapier is a very specialized weapon. You can go to battle with it, like it's not completely useless, but it really is designed as a dueling weapon for settling personal disputes. Whereas Silver was teaching people how to fight in good old-fashioned English sword and buckler and English sword and dagger. He would have called it a short sword, but it was kind of like a basket-hilted broadsword, for lack of a better term.
Kind of like I guess the Rob Roy, Scottish clay. Was it Claymore? Was it or not? No, not Claymore. The basket-hilted. I can
sometimes
see
called a claymore.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I can see it in my head. I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. The English ones were a little simpler than that. They had just a few bars, but they were like basically double-edged fighting swords with a basket hilt that offered you a lot of protection. And Silver was so upset by this, he wrote an entire book talking about how the rapier was bullshit and you shouldn't fight with it, and you shouldn't go to these guys to train.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of the speech that Mercutio gives in Romeo and Juliet looks like it might have been lifted from Silver's book, which he was working on at the same time as Shakespeare was doing Romeo and Juliet, because they both came out around the same time, like 1595, 1596.
So they probably read it when that's gold. I'm yoink.
It's true. And there is a theory, and I subscribe to this theory, that Mercutio is based on George Silver, because not only does he reiterate a lot of the stuff that Silver was talking about in his manuscript, but also Mercutio his name is derived from Mercury, and another common name for Mercury at the time was Quicksilver.
Yes. Oh, wow. That just gave you a little bit more in depth there because of weapons knowledge. That's really neat. That is really cool.
And a lot of people think of Romeo and Juliet as a love story, and it's really not. It's a play about violence and about the violence that was rampant in Italy at the time, and that was spreading over to England. Dueling was such an epidemic that I think it was a 10-year period in France, or maybe 12, but in this chunk of time in France, they lost about 8,000 nobles to duels, like ridiculous numbers. I mean, I might be off on the numbers there, but a tremendous amount of people were killing themselves in duels. And these were the best, the brightest, the nobility, really. And so in France, there were several different laws against dueling, but there was a romanticism about it. So anytime someone was arrested for dueling in France, they were often pardoned by the king because it was so so noble of them to.
Oh yeah, of course. It's yeah, absolutely. That's neat. That is neat.
Yeah, but Romeo and Juliet is a 3-day love affair between a 17-year-old and a 14-year-old that results in 5 deaths, 6 deaths.
Paris, yeah, all geez.
Paris, Mercutio, Tybalt, Romeo and Juliet, and Lady Montague also dies. She dies of a broken heart.
Yeah. Such a wonderful. Oh, that's great. Well, Todd, thank you very much for stopping by and having this lovely discussion. At this point in the conversation, I usually say, if there's something that you're like pushing or want to, like, I guess, final words or want to discuss, like projects that are coming up or what have you, as the saying goes, the floor is yours.
I wish I had something to tell you about, but I really don't. The pandemic has been kind of brutal to our art form. Like, we haven't
everyone.
Yeah, we haven't. Rape Your Wit is not open, and I don't know when it will open again.
I know. I talked to Dan about it. And he's looking forward to seeing us all there again. But yeah, it is what it is, right? You can't say much about that, what have you. So, any social media that you want to prescribe? Nope. Or nope. All right.
I mean, if you're interested in more historical stuff, go on YouTube. YouTube is a fabulous resource. Just type in rapier or small sword or long sword or just historical martial arts, and you'll get a wealth of information. I would recommend, don't watch fencing videos. Instead, watch technique videos where people talk about specific techniques and break them down, because that for us is going to be more interesting and important, because then you can look at it in slow motion and figure out how you can adjust things. And I remember you were talking about the changes that are happening at FDC. What's great about FDC is, because we are we've always been an organization that's been very open to people exploring stuff. Like, we've never standardized any of our disciplines, and we're structured. So, once you get past basic, all of the classic sword movements that have been with stage combat since the early days of old Hollywood. That means we can explore a lot more. And so we get to focus more on principles and instead of techniques. Because if you're going to understand why something works, then you can apply to whatever martial arts. So this new system where we're going to allow people to explore different types of martial arts within our system, I think is very exciting.
Absolutely. Well, my friend Todd, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for giving me a bit of your time and discussing quite an interesting topic and enlightening more people to the experience. So, skål, my friend. Cheers.
Thanks, man.
Thank you. That was awesome. It really was. Thank you, Todd, for stopping by, having a little bit of a time for a chat. Yeah. So, as per usual, this would be where I'd probably do a sponsorship, which I have yet to acquire. Hopefully soon. Someday. Yeah. Well, I guess that's it for today. Everyone, take care out there. The world's a scary, messed up place. But at least we have each other. So, I guess on that note, to you all, skål. Be well.